Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Hello, and welcome to Thriving While Aching, a podcast that inspires and offers insights on how to live a fuller life while navigating the challenges of pain. Last season, we went deeply into the journeys of adults who are finding joy and purpose while continuing to live with the inevitable aches of aging. This season, we turn the spotlight onto the unsung heroes of many of those stories, the caregivers and care partners who empower their loved ones to thrive, whether that's through nature escapades, preserving cherished family memories, or expressing themselves in art or music. And this season, Mike Eidsaune will be here to reflect, share from his wealth of experience, and offer invaluable advice. So, whether you're a caregiver or know someone who is, this season is for you. Let's dive in. In today's episode, we're joined by Cora and Danielle, two caregivers who walk us through their experiences of practicing self-care while dedicating themselves to their loved ones. We delve into the challenges they face and the importance of planning for life and for mobility issues, especially when dealing with physical constraints. Hi, Danielle. Welcome to Thriving While Aching. And let's start with you. Danielle, if you could just introduce yourself so that our listeners know a little bit about you. And particularly, I'm interested in about your background and how you became a caregiver.
Thank you again, Laurie, for having me on the podcast. I'm Danielle Mila. I'm a certified financial planner professional, and I'm a financial educator who focuses on helping family caregivers.
Wow. And how did you start and sort of move your career in that direction?
I opened a financial planning firm, and I was working with young professionals. And while I loved doing that, I shifted when I became a family caregiver myself. And I started to research the needs of family caregivers. I was just, nerd myself. I was Googling a bunch of things like research papers and what financial knowledge is available for family caregivers. And I found there to be very limited financial education resources for family caregivers. And as I went down that rabbit hole, I said, hey, this doesn't make sense. Family caregivers make up 20% or more of the population. Why isn't there financial education for caregivers? And that's when I shifted my niche over to family caregivers.
Oh, wow. So can you say a little bit about how you personally became a caregiver? What happened in your life?
I'm a sandwich generation caregiver. So I help an elderly grandmother, and I help with my mom with her health. As we sometimes know, caregivers are sometimes invisible caregivers due to our loved ones having invisible diseases. And my mother has an invisible disease. You'll never realize that she has an autoimmune disease, but she lives with it daily. And I help support her in caring for her and my grandmother.
Wow, Danielle. So you're balancing a lot. Talk about multi-generational. That's a lot of caregiving. Now I'm going to turn to Cora, our other guest. I know that you've been on a caregiving journey with your mother also, and we're talking about thriving while aching today. And it sounds like you've been a big part of helping your mother thrive. So can you say a little bit about the journey you've been on and how it's unfolded for you and your mother?
Well, she's 70 years old, and she recently fell 3 times in the past 5 months, which has definitely affected her hip and her movements and all that. As well as she has chronic fatigue syndrome, as well as dealing with migraines. So I've been living at home with her. I pretty much do everything for her. I cook, I clean, do the laundry. I take her dog out. I feed our cats. Pretty much everything I do for her. So when she comes home from work, she can just rest. I find it really rewarding. It kind of gives me a sense of purpose dealing with my own mental and health issues like migraines. I kind of didn't go to work for a while, so I kind of felt useless in life. So now being able to help my mom the way she helped me when I was little kind of feel like it comes full circle.
That's a great way to frame it. Now, both of you have emphasized the importance of not losing yourself in that caregiving process. So I want to ask, how do you ensure that you maintain a balance of caring for your loved ones and taking care of your own needs? Let's start with you, Danielle.
That's sometimes a difficult question. As an invisible caregiver, it's like you want people to see that you're there, that you're really a caregiver. But sometimes when you're caring for somebody else who has invisible diseases, it's hard to be as out and open about those things than other people are. In the last couple of weeks, I've actually realized that caregiving has put more of a toll on me than what I realized. Usually I'm the one who's in the ER with my loved one, and I was the one who had to be in the ER alone last week. And
Oh, Danielle.
that was kind of a pivotal moment in my life where I realized that I need to take care of myself more.
Absolutely. That is a great recognition. I mean, you talked about invisible caregiving, and you can even become invisible to yourself through the process. What about you, Cora? It seems like you do a lot for your mother. I want to hear a little bit more about that. How do you ensure that you maintain a balance between caring for your mother while also taking care of your own needs?
I've always lived with my mom just due to circumstances and just really just wanting to be around her. But as she's gotten older, she has definitely lost some of her independence that she wishes she had, and she keeps pushing herself, which sometimes makes it worse. So just trying to get her to limit herself and not overdo certain things. Sometimes if her hip acts up, she needs help getting off the couch, or sometimes when we come home, she'll sit on our stair stoop, and sometimes to get up, she'll need to grab me on my shoulder. I need to grab her hands and pull her up. There for a while, I let it consume my life where I'd be home with her and that's pretty much it. I just stay home and watch over her. But now I'm starting to realize, I'm just turned 25. I need to get my own life started. So now I'll come home, I'll cook her dinner and all that, and we'll watch some TV together, but then I'll go and do my own thing for the rest of the night.
And that takes some intention on your part, because it's easy to just kind of be in the routine of, just being alongside. I'm going to turn to Mike Eidsaune, our expert caregiver who's with us this season. Mike is here to provide his insight and deeper support for caregivers and their loved ones as they navigate their journey. Mike, you've heard what Cora and Danielle both expressed. When caring for someone, it's sometimes overwhelming, and it can be hard to find that balance between caring for your loved one and taking care of your own needs. In your experience, what would you recommend to our listeners to maintain that balance and thriving when you're taking care of a loved one?
Yeah, of course, Laurie. And I think I'm going to shock anyone with this answer about the importance of self-care as a family caregiver. What's important here is to understand that as a family caregiver, there's a lot of advice out there about the importance of self-care. And obviously, all of us would go, yes, I know how important it is, but I can't prioritize that over what I need to do to support this individual. And that's where we get stuck in sort of this quagmire. And as an industry, I think one of the things we failed to do for family caregivers is understand and be empathetic to that situation, that relationship situation. And so when we talk about, as a family caregiver, the importance of self-care, what we really try to do is be logical and really define what self-care can be, because it doesn't always have to be go to the spa for an hour and get a massage. And I think traditionally that's always been the case. You've got to take time out, and the reality for family caregivers isn't that. So with that in mind, with that sort of empathy as sort of the starting place, one of the things we like to do is have family caregivers focus on this idea that part of their role, part of their job, because, oftentimes family caregivers will put the job ahead of self-care. Reframing it to say, well, part of your job, part of the priority you have to make is self-care. Because if you aren't taking care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of this individual in the way that you should be. And that reframing of self-care as not just a nice to have, not something you're doing because you want to selfishly, but because it is part of the role. Think of it as like a prescription. Your doctor is prescribing this to you. You have to do it as a part of your role as a family caregiver. I think that could be one of the ways that folks open up to it. And then from there, I think self-care can look different for every individual that's receiving it. So it can be 10 minutes by yourself flipping through TikTok. It could be a 15-minute walk. It could be whatever it can be. It's up to the individual to define that, but it really is sort of taking that moment and identifying what is it that I need, where is my tank empty, and making sure that we refill it. And not just because it's something that you're doing selfishly, it's something something that you're doing as a part of your role and as a priority.
And Mike, I could not agree more. And I also feel like this is where your constant drumbeat of community comes in. Because I think the isolation really contributes to that imbalance, that it's all up to me or I have to do it all myself. When we can stretch as caregivers, even though we may be too tired or we don't feel we have the time, but to know we're in a community and that people are happy to help. That asking, they can't mind read, but if you can ask somebody to do something very specific, could you sit with this person, my loved one, for an hour? Would you be willing to pick up the groceries or the dry cleaning or whatever it is? People will do something specific, but you have to be willing to ask. And I think asking for help is part of self-care.
Absolutely.
And now I want to turn back to our guests. Every caregiver's journey is filled with unique challenges because every caregiver is unique. Cora, you mentioned earlier how caregiving gave you a sense of purpose, but you also mentioned how much you're doing for your mother. Do you have activities that you do for yourself that bring you joy?
I've been going to the gym every day. Before, I used to just watch TV with her for hours until we both go to sleep. But now I'll go home, make dinner, watch a soap opera an hour or two, and then I'll go to the gym and have the rest of my night to myself. I used to be really into that a few years ago, and then I got out of it, but now I'm starting to get back into that, and it's definitely affected my mental health as well. I'm so much better now, and I feel like it helps me be able to even help my mom too. So there's some days where it's hard to lift her, but now it's getting a little bit easier.
Exercise certainly is a great tool for self-care. Danielle, it seems like you're facing a different set of experiences since you're caring for both your mother and your grandmother. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What does that entail in terms of planning?
Yeah, so for my mom, it's planning for the retirement and ensuring that they're able to go on trips and vacations and live their life now before my mom gets in worse health. For my grandmother, it's ensuring that she's comfortable, that she's living somewhere that she's happy with, that she has care workers that are beside her, taking care of her. It's sometimes testing out products to ensure that it fits her needs. So it's two different types of planning.
It's also clear there's a lot of love and care that goes into that. And it's not, just thinking, but it's bringing your heart into it. Hearing Cora and Danielle, we hear again that being a caregiver can be challenging on so many levels, whether you have a job, a family, or are a patient yourself. I want to add the importance of taking care of your mental health as a part of this picture. Mike, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. I think mental health is obviously a huge component. And it's something we talk about as a society today more and more, which is fantastic. And I think for family caregivers, mental health, the importance of it stems from the challenges that are faced. This idea of guilt. Family caregivers, that role can be laden with guilt, frustration. There are tons of emotions that come out of this role. And oftentimes those emotions can lead to other emotions and challenges. And so really one of the things we recommend, and we've talked about this multiple times over this series, is this idea of finding community, not just to understand what's available to you from a resource perspective, but finding folks in your tribe that can really understand and empathize with you very specifically so that you can share, hey, here's what's going on today. And then you find that more often than not, there are 5, 6, 7 other folks in that circle that are dealing with the exact same emotion, the exact same challenge, the exact same frustration that you are. That can be an overwhelming positive feeling to see that you're not the only one that's getting frustrated with your care recipient or that feels sad or that feels angry. Those emotions are very, very normal. And without seeing someone else sort of either going through them or challenge themselves with those things, you can, again, feel very isolated and alone and guilty as a result. So finding that tribe and finding the community of folks who sort of understand what you're going through can be really important. You spoke to it too in the question, this idea of being willing to not just ask for help. I think asking for help can be a very daunting thing, but being very direct in what your needs are and really understanding those and then helping other folks understand what it is you need can be a really important thing to do as a family caregiver.
And you've mentioned something that is so simple and yet something that I think many people want to put off, and that is simply being willing to talk about how you're feeling, noticing it and being willing to say it out loud, and finding someone that you can say it to makes such a difference. It's such a simple thing, and yet many of us were just just taught to kind of stuff it all down, not really focus on it, try to ignore it or deny it. But that leads to worse outcomes for us. So the willingness to, say, this is how I feel. And maybe you don't have someone write around. You can also write it down. You can put it in a journal and then you can throw it out or shred it. You don't have to keep it. But somehow expressing it, and particularly expressing it and being witnessed, is something that really supports our mental health. I want to talk about another circumstance that caregivers can experience, which is working with mobility. Making sure our loved ones can move around comfortably and safely is a top priority as a caregiver. Cora, your mother has mobility issues that you're attending to. And Danielle, you're thinking ahead of time of all those extra steps that you need to take to make sure your mother's comfortable during a vacation. Can you both share some insights on managing and planning around these mobility concerns? Cora, let's start with you. I know that you're involved with your mother's care on several levels. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sometimes if her hip acts up, she needs help getting off the couch, or sometimes when we come home, she'll sit on our stair stoop. And sometimes to get up, she'll need to grab me on my shoulder. I need to grab her hands and pull her up. I'm trying to get her to go on walks with me. But with her hip right now, I don't want to push her too hard. But at the same time, I'm like, can't be sitting all the time because it makes it worse. So I'm trying to push her to walk a little bit more. I tried giving her CBD cream. That seems to help. Urged her to go to the doctors more often because that's one of the biggest things that kind of led to a lot of her issues, was not going to the doctors.
Cora, I'm sure that when you plan a vacation with your mother, there are things that you need to look up ahead of time to help with her mobility issues. Am I right?
She's still able to plan things, but I'd probably have to plan like the rental car and how far the place is. And depending on if her hip is good by then, having to get like a wheelchair or stuff like that. Like, definitely like where the hotel is, how close restaurants are, if they have ramps, how steep stairs are, because that's one of the big things she doesn't like anymore because she fell on stairs. She's kind of wary of that now.
So you'll sort of be scouting out ahead, even as you get there, about what will be appropriate and accessible and what will work. I'm turning to you, Danielle. Can you talk to us about how you're managing and planning around your mother's mobility concerns?
Yeah, so my parents are going on a vacation, especially when your health is declining. You want to make sure that you're going on those vacations and that you're making the best out of those vacations because you only live once at the end of the day. And so my parents are traveling to Europe this summer and actually in the next month or so. And we've been working together to try to create a plan so that my mother's as comfortable as possible. For my mom, that may be making sure that she's talking with her doctors about certain medications. That may be ensuring that she has a wheelchair after her flight. That may be ensuring that she has a taxi instead of getting public transportation. So we're really crunching the numbers and analyzing the numbers to make sure that she is as comfortable as she can on the trip and that she's not overexerting herself because she has to walk, miles on miles end after a flight, or she's not having to take public transportation because that's maybe too much for her body physically.
So your part of doing the caregiving really is thinking alongside your parents about sort of every step of the way, what she might need and how you can help her sort of think ahead and plan for that, both financially, but also to just imagine what it will be that she'll need, like a wheelchair when she gets off a flight. Mike, in your great experience, have you seen some ways that caregivers can think about and plan for ways to help their loved ones be safe in terms of mobility or in terms of taking trips?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, in fact, there's quite a few, and some are probably more obvious than others. I think thinking ahead, sort of doing sort of the walkthrough, as they call it, about what are we about to go do? What is that experience going to look like, given some of the unique challenges we're facing regarding mobility? So that's things like accessibility, understanding, what my loved one's needs are going to be, and not just from a tactical perspective, but thinking through what does this day look like after 4 hours, right? When we're at the end of the day and we're all tired, what is that experience going to look like for me and my loved one? So sort of playing it through in that way, coming up with a playbook in regards to that. That's going to do a couple things. One, it's going to make us feel a little bit better about the event. Maybe we're going to be a little bit less anxious about that event because we've played it through. But two, it's going to help us be a little bit more present when we're not constantly thinking about, okay, what's coming up next? We've got a plan in mind. Being present in those situations is obviously going to be a lot more enjoyable for everybody. The other aspect I don't think that gets enough attention, especially in regards to mobility, is this idea of empathy and loss of self and loss of self-identity. When an individual who's facing mobility issues and it is progressing, declining, let's say they're going from walker to wheelchair as an example. For that individual, that's a complete loss of identity. Being able to move around on a walker and have that independence to going to being wheelchair bound, that's a huge shift in that person's identity and who they are. And so for a family caregiver to be aware of that loss of self, that's going to make you a lot more empathetic. And it's probably going to make the situation less challenging and exhausting and frustrating for you as the family caregiver. If you can understand that, hey, there's a little bit of emotional challenge here that my loved one is dealing with. Maybe they're pushing back a little bit more than I think they should be, given that this is a real loss of self in moving one direction to the other. So we think about those things in terms of mobility, and this is obviously an issue that is very present for a lot of family caregivers. So really getting in, understanding, finding a community of folks who understand that situation and talking it through, I think is the last thing I would recommend. How do other folks deal with these situations? How do other folks deal with going to a baseball game or going to the zoo or going to a movie when there are those sort of mobility challenges? What things do they think about? Because the reality is, you're not the first family caregiver to go through this experience. So never assume that. For years and years and years, people have been dealing with this and finding solutions and finding ways around some of the common challenges that exist. Now it's about going out and identifying who those folks are and gathering that experience so that you can be better informed and more well-equipped to handle the challenges that are obviously going to come up.
Such an important piece of advice and information. I'm thinking about a caregiver I know who wanted to take a family member to an event that they had wanted to go to and went to the place ahead of time to sort of scout it out and realized that the only way to get from one floor to another was an escalator was simply not going to work in terms of mobility, and had to really find and go back in way back into an area to finally find an elevator that would be. But that advanced planning and thinking really made all the difference, as you say, to be present in the day and not get stuck or get stymied. And the other thing that I think you're mentioning in the planning is sometimes one party has a bigger imagination of what can be done in a day than the other. It may be the person who has some of these mobility issues. It may be the caregiver. But to, again, be very practical about how much energy something's going to take, and maybe to take a smaller bite rather than a larger bite in your imagination as you plan for it, so that it can be much more enjoyable and safer.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just add to that, this concept of taking a smaller bite, I think it really just ties back to setting better expectations and really just being willing to let go and adapt when things aren't going well. This I will pull from my 11 plus years of experience now as a parent to 4 boys and a daughter, so 5 kids total. You can't set the bar too high, especially when it comes to like public outings. You got to be willing to shift gears and move in another direction. And I think that's very, very applicable here. And quite frankly, that flexibility and that openness to the moment is going to make everybody's experience more enjoyable. When you're not stressed out about delivering on a vision that you've set in stone in your head, it's going to make the entire day, no matter what happens, feel better, feel more positive when you can just roll with it. So having that openness and being flexible and not setting too rigorous an expectation on how the outcomes is supposed to look, I think it'd be really, really helpful.
Yes, that is excellent. That's just advice for life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Mike, before we conclude this episode, I'd like to ask one final question to our 2 guests, Danielle and Cora. Danielle and Cora, based on your experiences, what key piece of advice would you offer to other caregivers? Danielle, would you start?
Live your life now as much as possible. Whether that's the small things, doesn't necessarily have to be going on a vacation. Live your life as much as possible now. Like, for example, we love Trader Joe's. It's a grocery store company, and they have small little carts that my daughter can push around the store. And that simple thing brings me joy. So find something in your life that brings you joy, even if it's as simple as, watching a comedy or getting outside for breath and fresh air. Sometimes that's what thriving is for some.
That's wonderful advice. Sounds like you have skills and talents on many levels, Danielle. Cora, do you want to share a piece of advice with our listeners? What have you learned from caring for your mother?
I learned not to be so hard on yourself and to really try and not lose yourself in the caregiver role. I noticed myself just having that being me and not having any hobbies, just focusing on her. So I'd say trying to definitely learn the balance between the two. And I definitely have to say thanks to her for raising me when I was younger and having the patience with me as a child. Definitely come full circle with some things. So I'm definitely grateful for the way she raised me.
Gratitude is a wonderful gift. Being able to feel grateful and feel the love and the appreciation. Cora and Danielle, thank you so much. This has been a delightful conversation. Thank you for showing up for the podcast and for sharing all this about your life, your advice, and your journey as a caregiver.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity to share my story.
So, Mike, we've heard a lot of different advice. What would you offer for those who are new to caregiving? Some resources that might be helpful when you're starting out on this journey?
We at caregiving.com, we really try to recommend people start with the condition. Really understanding the condition, whether that's chronic or situational, frankly, it can be either one. Really trying to better understand what's available, what research has been done, just sort of educating yourself about the 101s of the condition can be a great starting place. It's going to make you feel better as a family caregiver, being more informed, being a little bit more educated. I'm not suggesting you go out and get a PhD on Alzheimer's or whatever chronic disease your loved one is dealing with, but just being a little bit more equipped to partake in discussion with a doctor or your individual loved one, you really set a much better foundation for everything else that is to come. And I think secondly, and a very close second to that, is trying to find community. And whether that community is virtual or it's in-person physical community, I think either way, finding places where you can see yourself in the shared experience of others is going to be a tremendous, tremendous shortcut for you as an individual. In best case scenario, if you can find someone who's gone through a similar situation that you can rely on or pick up the phone and call when you have maybe a challenge or you just want to talk about what's going on, that can be a huge leg up as a family caregiver and making this all sort of feel a little bit more possible and tangible.
So before we conclude this episode, and in fact this whole season, Mike, we've heard from caregivers who've come from many different places and have many different situations, and we've learned a lot from them. A repeated theme that came up each episode, and that came from both the caregivers and from you, is the importance of building a support system in caregiving. And that system is going to look very different from one person to another because everybody's unique. As you said, there's not one caregiver. Every caregiver is a new caregiver. So could you expand on the role of the support system in caregiving?
Absolutely. And the first thing I want to do is define the support system. I think a lot of times people hear support system and they think support group. It's the first thing I think pops into people's minds. And I think we need to break that down a little bit. I think support groups are one type of support system. And I think a support system can look very different to individual. A support system could be something as simple as a blog that you find that speaks to, the loved one's condition or the situation or the relationship. And it's a support system because it speaks to you as an individual. You can relate to it. I think those are sort of the important parts of finding that support system, is finding something you can relate to, finding something you can see yourself in, finding something that you can pull from. I think those are the factors, sort of just characteristics of the support system I think family caregivers should be looking for. And so when you go about that process, I think obviously one place to look is your backyard. Do you have support systems like that that are geographically relevant to you? I think that can be a huge thing for family caregivers. You're reading about family caregiving issues on a national website is one thing. Reading about those same sort of issues as it relates to you in your state or in your city is an entirely new and more relevant sort of experience. So if you can find things that are sort of geographically relevant to you in your backyard, communities that are available, support groups that are going on, those are going to feel and I think speak more specifically to you as an individual. So I think those are some of the things I think about, some of the things we recommend for family caregivers. This idea of finding communities is one of the ways we pose it on our website. But either way, I think the idea and the prescription for a family caregiver is going to be very unique to the circumstance and the individual. So just being open and really sort of self-reflective and really understanding what's important to me and what types of support do I typically respond best to or find the most value out of. Though the answers to those questions I think are going to be really important in that process.
And that feels to me like the key, which is what kind of support systems are usually most helpful to me, and to import them into this new situation. As you were talking, I was thinking, oftentimes we hear support systems, as you say, a support group, or we think it has to be another person, but sometimes it's our pet. Sometimes it's that special place that we go in nature and we just take a moment and get grounded and we feel energized. Sometimes it's listening to music. Sometimes it's going to whatever is for us a worship kind of situation. All of those can be support to us as a whole person when we're engaged in caregiving. So I really appreciate that, the uniqueness, but as you say, being self-reflective to know what it is.
Right. I love the way you put that. I think that the constructing of your own individual support system can have a lot of different elements: informational, physical, emotional. I think that's a really, really great way to look at it. Having a framework or a blueprint that you as an individual just need to fill in. I think that's really smart. I think it's a really smart way to break it down.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be on this journey with you as we listen to all these caregivers and how they are creating some thriving. And I appreciate your insight and wisdom about that for sure.
Yeah, the experience has been phenomenal. Hearing these stories is obviously, I think, a really special thing and something I'm honored to be a part of. And I really do want to extend a really big thank you to all of the guests that you interviewed. I think sharing those stories is so impactful. And I think oftentimes people don't realize how important it is for others to be able to hear those stories. And, like we talked about, finding that support system, Alyssa's or Aisha's or Marilyn's story may not be an exact match to mine, but there are components of it that I can pull from and that I can sort of take away from and say, yeah, this is really relevant to me, or this is something I could have a takeaway in my experience. I think that's something that we need to do more of, and I applaud this group putting such an amazing sort of series together, because I do think it's going to be really profound and helpful for a lot of folks. So thank you.
We hope that you found this episode inspiring. We want to thank Danielle and Cora for sharing their experience and their insights. We hope our discussions will help shed a light on the important role of caregivers in patients' journeys. And of course, we want to thank you, our listeners. We believe that the journey of caregiving is as unique as each person it touches, and we are inspired by our guests, who are such marvelous examples of helping their loved ones thrive. We encourage you to keep the conversation going, sharing your experience and questions with us by reaching out at podcasts@ghlf.org and be a part of our thriving community. Be sure to check out the toolkit for caregivers that Mike has shared at the end of each episode. For more enriching content and resources, visit the show page at ghlf.org/listen. This podcast is made possible with support from Kenvue, sponsor of the Global Healthy Living Foundation. Until next time, may you and your loved ones thrive with unwavering strength and grace.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.